Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. Vice presidential candidate Senator J.D. Vance represents a populist economic philosophy new to the Republican Party. His take on a key economic proposal from his running mate, higher tariffs.
Donald Trump already imposed specific tariffs on specific industries. You didn't see the negative consequences come to light. In fact, what you saw was rising wages and rising take-home pay.
Tariffs are inflationary.
Well, not always.
We also get into a range of economic issues, deficits, taxes, and the bigness of big business.
Where you and I might actually agree on Lena Khan is that not all mergers and acquisitions are bad.
Author Michael Lewis on politics.
These are such polarized times, so you got to pick a side.
And the personal. From Moneyball to his latest on the Sam Bankman-Fried scandal, he specializes in living history.
First time I covered Silicon Valley during the internet bubble, and I can remember wandering around and being surprised by just how many Republicans there were there.
Plus, the rest of today's news that got us squawking, Moderna's new vaccines, Boeing on the edge of a strike, young bankers, very long hours.
I was trying to figure out 100 hours a week, how many hours a day you'd be working 7 days a week. You know, you could maybe do 12 hours, 5 days, and then 10 hours the other two.
It's Thursday, September 12th. Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick, along with Joe Kernen and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg asked members of its largest union not to hit the picket line over what he is calling frustrations of the past, saying it would hurt the company's recovery, and that plea coming ahead of a vote by 33,000 union members, and it's today on the tentative 4-year deal with the aerospace giant. The current contract expires at midnight. A potential strike, it's all Boeing needs at this point, right? Could shut Boeing factories in Washington and Oregon, but maybe they could, use it to get their quality issues under control. Boeing workers' last strike was in 2008. It shut down plants for more than 50 days.
The union leadership has signed off on this and said it, but there are questions whether the rank and file will go along. There are big pay raises, but maybe not as high as some had been looking for. The leadership at the union was able to say, okay, they're going to build the next plane there too. So that gives longer term security, but it's just a question of what those on the workforce right now really want to see. Some news just out from Moderna as it kicks off its annual Research and Development Day. The company saying that it will slash its R&D investments by $1.1 billion, but that is not due to start until 2027. Moderna is plans to seek FDA approval this year to expand its use of its RSV vaccine to 18 to 59-year-olds at high risk of severe disease. It's also scrapping plans to seek accelerated approval for its standalone flu shot to focus on its COVID and flu shot combination. And Moderna says that the FDA does not support the company's plan to seek accelerated approval of a cancer vaccine that it's working on in partnership with Merck based on the phase 2 results. All of that adding up to a knee-jerk reaction of disappointment on the street. Looks like Moderna shares are down by almost 7%, adding to the losses for the year, down by close to 30%.
Miserable looking chart, down from $180 or so high, but doesn't even come close to giving you the full picture, because in 2022 it was $400. So it's from 380 down to 70.
Hey, look, this is a similar story. This is a similar story.
To
what we saw,
Pfizer.
and if you look at the 5-year, it's up almost 350%. This was the COVID vaccine craze. You saw the ability to bring something when there was such huge demand for it. The questions are what that the frame that they've set up, whether they can continue to knock out other vaccines. Cancer has been the big one that people have been watching so closely. So that is disappointing to hear that the FDA is not going to put that up for accelerated approval at this point.
And I don't know what it means if you're, because whenever Bonsell comes on, he's very bullish about the prospects for cancer. And when you say cancer vaccine, it's different than what you're thinking about with other vaccines. But you're thinking about a way to treat cancer using the messenger RNA platform. Right. And if you're taking $1 billion out of does it make it less?
Well, they're not going to do that till 2027. There have been concerns, other investors wanting them to slow their investments sooner. So they are going to pare it back, but not till 2027.
Let's tell you what's going on with OpenAI right now, because its valuation could be moving higher today. The company behind ChatGPT reportedly in talks to raise between $5 and $7 billion. We put OpenAI's valuation at $150 billion. This funding round said to be led by Thrive Capital, which already, of course, is a major investor in the firm. Microsoft, Apple, and NVIDIA also investors in the company. The big question, though, is once you get to these type of valuations, at some point people are going to want exits at these valuations. There's not lots of ways to exit at these valuations without pursuing an IPO. If you're going to pursue an IPO, you may very well have to restructure some of the company because, of course, there is this sort of unique nonprofit profit status situation in terms of how the company's cut up and the different units of it. So we're going to be really, I think, watching. But I think this is a setup longer term for this company to be a full for-profit entity, and one that may very well one day trade on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah. I think I would want an exit at a valuation like that. Pretty good deal if you've been along for the whole ride, for sure.
If you were there early, it's a great thing. The question, by the way, is they need the money. I think people, we talk about OpenAI as one of the great, inventors of this moment, and it is very true. They still lose an enormous amount of money, and the scale of it is so unique that the better they do, the more it costs them. It's not like most businesses because they're having to continue to invest more, not just in the R&D side, but in the NVIDIA chips and other chips that they're going to need just to power the whole system. So each time somebody comes online, it's not clear that they're necessarily making more and more money. There's a margin issue, and I think they're going to have to figure that out over the next coming months and years.
You would think at some point where all of a sudden the economies of scale start making sense, and the costs become more fixed, and you can bring in.
Well, that's what these valuations are certainly based on. Yeah. Dealing with an overwork outcry on Wall Street, the Wall Street Journal reporting that J.P. Morgan and Bank of America plan to limit and more closely track the hours of their young bankers. This comes after a Wall Street Journal investigation detailed a dangerous culture of overwork on Wall Street. According to people familiar with the situations, J.P. Morgan will now cap junior investment bankers' hours at 80 hours a week in most cases, although if you're on a live deal, that goes out the window. Bank of America is implementing a new timekeeping tool that requires junior bankers to go into more detail about how their time is spent. The Journal investigation revealed that junior bankers at Bank of America were routinely instructed to lie about their hours to avoid exceeding hourly limits. It comes after a heart attack that killed a 35-year-old at one of the banks, and this is a decade after there was another situation where someone died after working very long hours, and a lot of soul searching that kind of took place on Wall Street as a result. Andrew, what do you think?
I mean, look, we've been writing about this issue for many, many years. We've had so many, there have been suicides, there have been folks who've ended up in the hospital, all sorts of things. I don't know. Having said that, the culture of Wall Street has been such for so many years that people have always worked. I mean, this is what they would even argue that they've paid for in some ways. But the idea that, the Journal reporting that some of these people were lying about the hours they were putting in because their bosses were, there's clearly a problem here, but the problem has been one that we've known about for, decades at this point.
And some of these initial starting salaries are as high as $200,000. So it definitely comes with high compensation, but maybe a new way that people are looking at
Never
things
worth
too.
It, though.
I was trying to figure out 100 hours a week, how many hours a day you'd be working 7 days a week. You could maybe do 12 hours, 5 days, and then 10 hours the other 2 days on the weekend or something. It takes a lot to be able to put in that many hours.
Yeah, it does.
Yep.
Yeah.
No family, obviously.
No. Or sleep or outside life.
Right.
Yeah.
I just can't. I figure they should be better at figuring out earnings estimates if they're working this hard. I mean, it seems like they'd be better.
Bankers.
It seems like they'd be better at what they do for putting all that time in, or they need to hire a few more people, don't you think?
Well, I think that's part of the problem is the banks cut back. All of a sudden,
Right.
You've got M&A activity kind of taking off, people gearing up for it a lot. You've got to put more hours on the people who are there that have survived through that period.
Right. Well, better them than us, I guess.
Tease will be next.
You don't want to miss what's coming up on Squawk Pod. Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. He's on our set for an extended conversation about tariffs, about Donald Trump's plans for the economy, and about immigration.
If the path to prosperity was flooding your nation with low-wage immigrants, then Springfield, Ohio would be the most prosperous city in the world.
Plus, how he's preparing for the next debate, his own against Governor Tim Walz.
I think our debate will matter because the American people, they do care about their vice presidential candidate, but I think the presidential debate matters so much more.
This is Squawk Pod with Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Stand by, Joe. Here's Mike. Q.
Good morning and welcome back to Squawk Box live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. By the way, Republican Vice Presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance, as you know, has a lot of strong relationships in finance and on Wall Street. And CNBC.com is reporting that Vance's supporters are mobilizing to help him raise millions of dollars for the campaign. Today, Vance is going to headline two fundraisers in New York City, hosted by some of his top supporters in the financial industry. Each of the events is expected to raise more than $1 million for the Trump-Vance campaign. But before any of that gets started, Senator Vance is going to join us on set here. He brought some friends. It's nice. They're here already. They're like looking under desks and searching around.
Sizing us up.
So, yeah, they looked at me. They did. They gave me a, I don't know.
Can you blame them?
I'd be looking at Steck.
I look at you every day.
You do. I'd be looking at Steck if I were, because you got I don't know, the hat, the baseball hat pulled down.
Looks like you could do some moves.
It does. You're dangerous. I always wanted to be dangerous. You know what I mean? At a bar, never was. Never. Andrew, that's not our thing. We got to appeal.
I wish.
We need to appeal in other ways. I can even do moves, and no one believes it.
Like Elaine?
I wanted to be able to play the guitar.
Seinfeld?
A lot of things. I wanted to do a lot of things.
We heard from former President Trump at Tuesday night's debate, and today we have his vice presidential candidate here with us on set. Joining us now, Ohio, the great state of Ohio, Senator J.D. Vance. We grew up, well, long before you grew up. I grew up in a part of Cincinnati. You're from Middletown, and you've been on this show before, Senator.
I have been.
With Steve Case.
That's right.
When you were involved with that. And I think for Hillbilly Elegy, I don't know if it was the book tour or what, but so we've met before, but it's great to have you on.
Good to see you. Good morning, guys.
We're struggling how to start. We could do a post-mortem on the debate, but because we're so interested in trying to get into your economic beliefs.
Sure.
Given that, as we now know, people's economic beliefs can evolve, as we've seen maybe from former President Trump's opponent. But I'm wondering whether yours have evolved, because then we'll get into some of the things you
Sure.
said in the past. And
Yeah.
how much daylight right now is there between what you believe as would I call you an economic populist? Is there daylight between you and President Trump right now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, obviously he selected me as his running mate, and I'm trying to run to implement and win on the Trump agenda. But I think that President Trump's economic views are actually pretty straightforward American conservatism, which is we need to manufacture things in this country. We need common sense energy and regulatory policies to be able to make things. And the best way to lift up workers is to promote good jobs and good wages, not to just throw everybody on welfare, which I think is in some ways the main thrust of the Kamala Harris economic policy. So there's definitely some element of populism to it, because look, I do think that for 30 years in this country, we shipped a lot of good manufacturing jobs to places like East Asia. Now China makes some of the critical things that we need, antibiotics, prescription drugs, even, God forbid, the weapons that our troops would need if we went to war against a nation like China. So we have to be a little bit smarter about our own self-reliance as a nation. That is one departure, I think, between President Trump's vision and, frankly, 30, 40 years of failed leadership in this country.
A lot of what I think of as populism, though, seems like it's almost diametrically opposed to certain aspects of capitalism. And there are certain groups, and I don't even want to mention the name of it, but they claim you as a strict adherent to populism. I don't know if you know the group I'm talking about. But you have said we should raise corporate taxes in the past. The former president wants to cut the 21% rate down to 15, I think. You said 28 or even higher, that these big corporations deserve that.
Well, what I've said is that we need to lower taxes on corporations that are creating jobs in this country and raise tariffs on corporations that are shipping jobs overseas and manufacturing overseas. Look, if you're trying to take advantage of Chinese slave labor and then use American markets to make a profit on your product, I do think, and I know Donald Trump thinks, that we should try to penalize these companies, but we want companies that are investing in America, hiring America, and creating good American jobs to thrive. But we have to recognize there's a fundamental difference between a national corporation that's creating good jobs in this country and a foreign corporation that's benefiting from Chinese slave labor.
It sounds like industrial policy that the Democrats get criticized for.
Oh, no, it's not. Look, whatever you want to call it, man, the problem is, look, Chinese slaves making $2 a day, and they get caned working 72 hours a week if they want to work 70 hours a week instead. You want to allow American manufacturers to benefit from that cheap labor. Not only is it going to destroy good American jobs and wages, it's going to decimate our core manufacturing industry, which I think makes us less productive over time. The final and most important point is it makes us reliant on foreign nations to make some of our critical stuff. Now, Donald Trump does believe in trade, and I believe in trade, but we believe in trade that's actually going to benefit American workers, not destroy American jobs. So the final point is, look, as you've seen on this campaign, there have been a lot of outside groups who try to claim that President Trump or I agree with every single thing that they say. President Trump speaks for himself, and I speak for myself. So don't necessarily assume that everything you hear written about him or me is true. Obviously, they lie about him quite a bit. But he really does believe, and frankly, he's been right about this for 40 years, we have to make more of our own stuff. We have to build more in America, and we need a corporate tax policy that promotes that. And yeah, sometimes that does mean if you're shipping jobs overseas, you're going to be penalized.
What are the lies that they're telling about you that you don't agree with?
Well, I think one of the things that says, for example, about Donald Trump's economic policies is that somehow they're going to jack up inflation, which is rich coming from Kamala Harris, whose economic policies have directly led to inflation.
But tariffs are inflationary.
Well, not always, right? Let's just take...
They're either inflationary or people aren't buying the products anymore.
Well, let's just take one example. So one of the classic examples that economists use to attack, or some economists, I should say, use to attack Donald Trump's economic policies is the tariffs that he imposed on washing machines and other dishwashers. So they show a chart that says, well, look, a few months after this tariff, the price of dishwashers went up a little bit. But if you look over 2 years, actually the price of dishwashers went down. You induced a lot of American factories to invest in American workers and American-made products. And the price of dishwashers has actually lagged behind the price of a lot of other home appliances. So sometimes when you induce investment and capital formation in the United States of America, it does lower prices on American workers. And again, the experience of Donald Trump's presidency, he was president for 4 years. He did impose tariffs sometimes to induce more investment in American workers. And what happened? We had 1.5% inflation, rising take-home pay, and the best economy for workers in 40 years.
That's different than across the board.
Senator,
tariffs,
but when people say that Donald Trump is going to destroy the economy, he was already the leader of the American economy for 4 years. We had rising prosperity, broad-based middle-class wage growth.
Senator,
that is a record I'd like to get back to.
Senator, I think the question, though, on the tariffs is, and it's where Joe is going, because they're across the board and they're not as targeted, it's unclear. There are certain industries that, unfortunately, we don't have. Now, would it be great if our country were to invest in some of these industries that we're missing on the manufacturing side? But the amount of time it may very well take to, quote unquote, induce every industry to invest here to manufacture. That's the complication with the plan. So when you see, for example, like a Goldman Sachs report come out suggesting that this actually becomes not just a massive tax, but a massive drain on the economy, what do you think? And then just a related question, because a lot of people have said this. Do you believe that the entire across-the-board tariff would go into effect, or should we think of it as some kind of negotiating cudgel, if you will, with China for other things?
Well, first of all, I do think that it's negotiation. Donald Trump is a negotiator. He believes in using tariffs for negotiation, but he also does believe in using tariffs to induce more manufacturing, more capital formation in our country. But Andrew, the problem with the argument here is when people say these tariffs are going to have an effect, Donald Trump already imposed specific tariffs on specific industries. You didn't see the negative consequences come to light. In fact, what you saw was rising wages and rising take-home pay. So when people say you can't do this in a narrow way, you can't do it in a broad-based way, I just think that doesn't actually fit with reality. And there's actually a deeper argument here that I think Donald Trump really, again, understands and understood better than a lot of people who said that somehow American prosperity was going to come by shipping our steel industry and our pharmaceutical industry overseas. They were wrong and he was right. So maybe he's right about his policies and the effect they're going to have on the future, too. But one of the critical conceits that our bipartisan consensus made over the last 40 years is that you could separate the manufacture of things from the design of things. You open up an iPhone and it says, I think it says designed in Cupertino, California. The implication, of course, is that it's manufactured in Shenzhen, China. But what we're finding out is that the people who are manufacturing things, they innovate, they become more productive. They develop the critical skills necessary to get better at manufacturing, and then they start designing the things too.
Right.
If we're not doing enough manufacturing in our own country, we're going to lose our tech edge, and then we're going to be in a world of hurt.
Senator,
so there's
no
a critical
question.
dynamic difference. Go ahead.
The flip side is it creates an export problem because there'll be retribution. I've gotten emails even in the past week from viewers of Squawk who are farmers in the Midwest who are worried, deeply worried, that depending on how these tariffs play out, that it's actually going to affect them on the opposite end.
Well, Andrew, this actually highlights, again, we have to look at experience versus some of these ridiculous predictions from people who have an axe to grind against Donald Trump. I'm, of course, not saying the farmers fall into that category, but when did America, for the first time maybe in our history, become a net food importer, meaning we need to take in more food than we produce ourselves? 2023, under the policies of Kamala Harris. When Donald Trump was president and doing all these things that certain pundits say are going to lead to terrible outcomes, what actually happened? America was a net food exporter. We grew more of our food than we needed. That is an important thing. One of the critical mistakes that we made, again, is that we became dependent on foreign nations for the goods that we need. Now we're becoming dependent on foreign nations for the food that our children need to eat. This is insanity. We have to be self-reliant. We have the biggest economy in the world. Every business, every foreign country, every competitor wants access to American markets. If you want access to American markets, you can't use Chinese slave labor to produce your products. You've got to be able to use American workers, and that's the whole thrust of Donald Trump's economic
policies. Do you think Apple's
policies.
an evil company?
Yeah, can we talk about big tech? Yeah,
Let's talk about big
you
tech.
seem to have kind of
to answer Becky's question, do I think Apple's an evil company? No. Do I think that sometimes they benefit from Chinese slave labor? Yeah, and that's pretty sick. And I think that a company that wants to benefit from American markets should also have to pay American workers a fair wage.
So I guess that's leading to your feelings on big tech, because it would seem that you are somewhat conflicted. I would think what I want to finally get to is whether you'd keep Lena Khan on as in antitrust concerns. But so we mentioned Steve Case. I mean, Peter Thiel. You've got strong connections with a lot of Silicon Valley,
sure.
But I also think you have you've talked about your fear of the power of big tech.
Oh, sure.
As well. So is it a complex relationship?
Well, look, I think that there's a difference between little tech and big tech. If you look at my friends in the tech industry, whether Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, these are folks who are investing in upstarts. And yeah, some of them invested in upstarts that became monopolists like Facebook, but all these guys recognize that when you have companies like Facebook and Google censoring American citizens, making it harder for Americans to speak in their own political process, that is a major problem. And yeah, I do think that there should be an antitrust solution to it. Of course, Donald Trump started the antitrust lawsuit against Google during his administration the first time, and we've got to be concerned about these mega companies that censor Americans. Now, look, Lena Khan and I disagree on some things, we agree on some things. I think where you and I might actually agree on Lena Khan is that while I share her view that we should be concerned about big tech companies and some of the mergers that lead to the censorship of American citizens. Look, I do think that not all mergers and acquisitions are bad. And sometimes in the technology space, in the private equity space, you need to let some companies buy other companies. That's how investors get capital returns. That's how you promote capital formation. Just because Google maybe shouldn't have bought YouTube and used it to censor Americans doesn't mean every merger is bad.
But what mergers are good and which are bad? How do you determine that? How does American business look at that and say, okay, these are areas we can proceed instead of living under a fear of we don't know what's going to happen?
Well, I think our antitrust policy has been pretty clear on this, right? I mean, massive major mergers where you have companies that dominate whole markets. They're extracting massive corporate profits. Our antitrust laws have recognized for a century that that's a major problem. I really don't care about a medium-sized business buying a small-sized business, and I do think Lena Khan has occasionally gotten a little over-aggressive there, but I agree with her on big tech. I really do.
Senator, there's a fascinating piece today. I don't know if you saw it. I was going to talk to you about entitlements. This has to do with means-tested programs being the real issue. And you've been reluctant to call for reform of Medicare or Social Security. This plays into your favor in basically saying most discretionary income is eaten up by these means tests, whether it's Medicaid or food stamps or any of these support systems that have, since Bill Clinton tried to reform it back in the, I don't know if you were around. I know I was. But when he reformed
I was a young guy, but I was around.
So back then, the bottom quintile got $7,000 in inflation-adjusted dollars. It's $64,000 of support now that we have. It's grown, beyond anything anyone can imagine. How would you rein that in? Is that something that would make sense?
Well, of course, those dollars don't go as far thanks to Kamala Harris's inflationary economic
But this
policies.
is inflation adjusted. $64,000.
We have to look at this. So go back to 2019. The U.S. federal budget was about $4.4 trillion. In 2024, it'll be close to $7 trillion. All right, so $2.5 trillion of additional spending in 4 years. Most of that delta is not Social Security and Medicare. It's discretionary programs. It's a whole host of non-Medicare, non-Social Security, non-discretionary programs.
It's also interest on debt.
It's interest on debt. Why do we have high interest on debt? Because we're spending way more money than we have.
And interest rates are higher.
Well, interest rates are higher in part because energy costs are higher and inflation overall is higher. So when you have inflationary policies and you have policies like Kamala Harris, which has made it harder for Americans to afford energy, that drives up the interest rate, which does drive up our debt servicing costs. So we've had a total economic whammy under Kamala Harris. It's been bad on every single set of policies. But if you lower energy costs, you lower interest rates, you make the debt more serviceable, and you bring down some of the ridiculous discretionary spending, you can get the American federal budget over the medium term on a much more sustainable pathway. The problem
energy
that I
costs
have
are down. We were talking about that this morning, too. Energy costs are down. We're expecting the Fed to lower rates.
Well, since Kamala Harris became vice president, energy costs for American families are up about 45%, right? Household energy costs. So maybe they've gone down a little bit
Even
in the past few months.
It's still at the pump.
But at the baseline from 4 years ago, it's a total disaster. And again, that does lead to higher interest rates, which leads to higher debt servicing costs. Now, you asked about Social Security and Medicare. Look, there are some problems that I think that we absolutely should look at. For example, we have a massive fraud problem in Social Security and Medicare because you have illegal aliens who are collecting Social Security and Medicare, sometimes fraudulently. I've had constituents, I've even had friends who have gone to the IRS, who have gone to the Social Security Administration and say, I have evidence that an illegal alien is collecting my Social Security benefits. That is terrible for the federal budget. But then the Kamala Harris administration has basically said, no, we're not going to reveal private information, even if it's an illegal alien who's stealing your Social Security. That blows up the federal budget, too. So before we start talking about doing anything to the benefits for Americans who have earned them, let's deal with the illegal alien fraud in our Social Security and Medicare system. I think that costs us a lot of money.
Yeah, the Goldman Sachs report is everywhere, and you heard it the other night. You heard Vice President Harris. A lot of the analysis that went into that report is based on immigration. And I guess if you were to close the border completely and try to expel 13, 15 million, deport undocumented people that are here, that would take a half of a percentage point off GDP every year. To me, it seems like things cost money that I don't know if Americans would choose to open the southern border and allow all the people that come in to stay for a half a point of GDP. That doesn't make sense to me. But do you see the analysis that there have been positive aspects to for the jobs market and for the labor situation from immigration?
I've certainly seen these reports, and look, for a generation, Wall Street has said that the way to create prosperity in this country is to flood the country with cheap labor and offsource our manufacturing to places like China, which use cheap slave labor. What that's actually led is to communities like Springfield, Ohio, where you have 20,000 Haitians who have come in. Housing costs are unaffordable, communicable diseases are on the rise, and people can't afford to live a good life in this small Ohio town. If the path to prosperity was flooding your nation with low-wage immigrants, then Springfield, Ohio would be the most prosperous country and the most prosperous city in the world. America would be the most prosperous country in the world because Kamala Harris has flooded the country with 25 million illegal aliens. What's actually happened is that over the past 3.5 years, while we've had this massive influx of illegal labor, what's happened? We've had skyrocketing inflation, lower take-home pay, Americans more dissatisfied with the direction of the country and the economy than they've been in a generation. This is not the path to prosperity, no matter how much a Wall Street bank says that it is. Now, this is an important distinction, though, between Kamala Harris's economic policies and Donald Trump's economic policies. Donald Trump believes the path to prosperity is to invest in our country, invest in American workers, and build out the middle class and the great American manufacturing sector that provides the foundation for the American middle class. Kamala Harris wants to import cheap labor and offshore our manufacturing plants to even cheaper labor overseas. That is not the path to prosperity. We've tried it for 40 years, and it has been a failure.
What would the first regulatory actions that another Trump administration would begin with on day one?
Drill, baby, drill.
Drill, baby.
It's the most important thing that we can do. It lowers inflation. It creates a lot of good jobs. It makes it more competitive for us to manufacture in our country because, of course, a lot of the inputs.
We just had Amos Hochstein on who said this is the greatest renaissance in American energy production ever under the Biden administration.
Oh, I think that's preposterous. I mean, look, we're way below baselines in oil production per day. You talk to folks who work in natural gas, they'll tell you we could be producing 2-3 times as much natural gas in this country. It's been a total disaster under the Biden-Harris administration. And again, you just look at the energy costs. You look at how much Americans are paying for energy compared to 3 years ago. If it was so successful, then why are Americans paying 40% higher when we're sitting in Pennsylvania, we're sitting on the Saudi Arabia of natural gas.
We're producing more crude oil than any country ever.
We're producing a lot less crude oil than we could be producing. Of course, America has a lot of crude oil, but if you look at what we were producing under Donald Trump and you look at where we were headed and you compare it under Kamala Harris, we're producing about 3 million barrels less per day than we should be producing if we just had smarter energy policies like we had under Donald Trump. And by the way, oil is not even the big one. Oil is a mistake, and Kamala Harris has been a disaster. It's why gasoline prices for Americans are up, 35-40%. But natural gas is actually where we have, again, we have 500 years of effectively limitless natural gas. We could be powering the world. We could be sending great energy resources to Europe. We could be absolutely crushing it in the natural gas economy. Thanks to Kamala Harris, we're not.
I didn't say that we wouldn't talk about the debate. I just said we'll wait to talk about it a little bit. But as it was occurring, one of the common criticisms was we don't know any more really about Kamala Harris's economic policies, about her previous positions,
sure,
because President Trump didn't prosecute that debate properly.
I think he did, but go ahead.
So you were watching and you didn't have any frustration with what he was focusing on versus what he could have said about the vice president?
Look, I think his closing statement was a critical piece of the debate because he drove home the entire message up to that point, which is Kamala Harris says she wants to do all these great things. Kamala Harris is currently the vice president of the United States. Why isn't she doing it now? Look, I think a lot of her economic policies are insane. But even if you separate the slogans and the platitudes and say, what does Kamala Harris actually believe? If she believes it, do it now. Yet the actual results of her leadership has been higher inflation, lower take-home pay, a wide open southern border. This is a woman who for 3.5 years has had a position of power. She's utterly failed, and now she's asking the American people for a promotion. I don't think they're going to give it to her, and I think Donald Trump made that point incredibly effectively. Now, I do believe the moderators, I think they asked more about ridiculous lies about Donald Trump more than they asked about the actual economy. I think there were 2 questions about the economy. Kamala Harris, of course, brought up the ridiculous Charlottesville hoax instead of defending her actual economic record. So there are a lot of problems with the debate, but I think Donald Trump did a good job. The moderators did a pretty disgraceful job.
We've got plenty of places to still go with this. Do you have any?
Yeah, looking back, do you think there'll be a second debate? Donald Trump suggested yesterday.
And then we'll talk about your debate and how you're going to prepare. Does your debate matter?
I think it matters a lot less than the presidential debate.
Will there be another debate?
I can check my ego at the door. Most people are voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, or frankly against one of those candidates. I think our debate will matter because American people, they do care about their vice presidential candidate, but I think the presidential debate matters so much more. is there going to be a second debate? I think it's an interesting question. It's telling to me that while some pundits walked away from the debate and said Kamala Harris did great, the actual undecided voters appear to think that Donald Trump did better.
It wasn't just
which is who you're appealing
Hugh Hewitt, who's a very conservative commentator, said he thought President Trump lost the debate.
Yeah, I love Hugh. I disagree with him, and I think that when you see how the undecided voters react, that's what actually matters the most. But it's telling that immediately after the debate, Kamala Harris came out and said, yes, I'd like to do another debate. If you think things went so well, you're normally not asking for a rematch right away. Like when a boxing match happens, the guy who loses is typically the one who's immediately asking for a rematch. Yesterday. But look, I think that the American people saw the difference between Kamala Harris, who's all slogans and all platitudes, no detail, no real agenda, and no real explanation for why she said she wanted to ban fracking, but now she doesn't. She said she wanted to defund the police, but now she doesn't. She said she wanted to open the border, but now she doesn't. She can't even explain these viewpoint changes, much less explain the policy behind them. Donald Trump actually has a record. And I think that is actually the most striking difference between these two campaigns is you got two people with a record. Donald Trump with a 4-year record, Kamala Harris with a nearly 4-year record. She's running away from a record. Donald Trump's running to his record because it was great. It was the record of peace and prosperity for this country, and we got to get back to it.
And one of her first decisions was Governor Walz. You would have an opportunity, I would imagine, to look at some of the policies in Minnesota that were passed by the governor.
Crazy stuff.
That was her first decision, was to pick this gentleman.
That's exactly right. And I think it's telling that with her first decision, she chose to select a guy who wanted to do some ridiculous things in Minnesota, wanted to give driver's licenses to illegal aliens, for example. I think that tells you who Kamala Harris really is, and it tells you which part of her party she actually listens to. But look, I'm going to use my debate opportunity to try to prosecute the case against Kamala Harris, because she's ultimately going to be the president if the American people elect her. And I have to remind people, of course, that Donald Trump's presidency was one of peace and prosperity. That's what I'm going to do as well. I mean, the way that I take these things is I try not to sort of over-prepare. I think if you're scripted or you're over-rehearsed, it comes across the wrong way. You don't want to think too much. You just want to actually answer the questions, okay? And so the way that I prepare is by reading a lot about the policy, trying to understand how the policy, of course, affects the lives of Americans, and then just answering the questions directly. One thing I'll say, much different. You guys have been tougher, certainly, than the debate moderators were on Kamala Harris. I think it's really telling that me and Donald Trump will go anywhere and talk to anybody. By the way, questions have been unfair, but you guys have asked me real questions about my record and my views and Donald Trump's views. Why is Kamala Harris so afraid of actually going before the American media and answering questions? And can we trust a person who's terrified of friendly American media to sit in a private room with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping and actually advocate for the American people's best interest? I don't. I think she's incompetent, and that's why she won't go through the American media process.
Well, those are the questions you're going to get here. And maybe most importantly, Skyline chili or Gold Star chili?
Look, they're both good. I'm definitely a partisan of Skyline chili. We have one like a
Skyline.
half a mile. Yeah, big time. My wife loves it. She's vegetarian. So Skyline, you can get really good vegetarian chili, really good meat chili. So it's a very good
Montgomery
very good
and ribs are
Grater's
ice cream. Montgomery.
Why can't have both?
You can see how
you can go to Montgomery for ribs and then to Grater's for ice cream. But seriously, Grater's is the best ice cream that exists anywhere in America.
They don't cheap out on it.
I'm glad you're backing me up. We could talk about ice cream for a while. The tell.
Agree on. Grater's for the win.
Grater's for the win, Andrew.
But the tell for a good quality of ice cream is how heavy it is. Because the heavier it is, that's when they use cream and not milk. Grater's ice cream is very heavy.
For Christmas, the peppermint stick, it's like, there's so much candy in there.
It's unreal.
It is.
Yeah. High quality ingredients. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And we ended on that. I don't want any criticism about not being serious. We ended on it. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Next on Squawk Pod, author Michael Lewis, who chronicled Wall Street in The Big Short and Liar's Poker, sports in Moneyball, and the Sam Bankman-Fried scandal in Going Infinite. Now he is spearheading a new project in The Washington Post, and it humanizes government workers as the Trump campaign pledges, again, to drain the swamp.
I would love for the Trump operation to sort of like be poked and prodded a bit more about this plan, the Project 2025 plan.
Welcome back to Squawk Pod.
You are watching Squawk Box right here on CNBC. I'm Andrew Ross Sorkin. along with Joe Kernen and Becky Quick. We got a lot going on this morning. Our next guest is best-selling author Michael Lewis, who wrote so many of my favorite books. I say that plural, including, of course, The Big Short, Fifth Risk, Moneyball, and the OG of it all, Liar's Poker. Going Infinite about FTX's founder, Sam Bankman-Fried. He's got the paperback out. He also recently launched an opinion series for the Washington Post, which says it's going in search of, quote, the essential public servant. We've got so much to talk to him about. Michael, it's great to have you on the program.
Andrew, good to see you.
I don't know if you had an opportunity just to hear J.D. Vance. I'd actually just love to get some of your reactions even to that before we get into so many of the other issues. Anything strike you?
Well, my first reaction is I'm so glad I don't have to run for public office. I mean, it's just like, nothing in particular. But having to sort of like toe the Trump line, it's got to be hard on TV. He comes on and says stuff, and some of it's true and some of it's not. The thing that I guess that he's been saying lately that speaks directly to some of the work you just mentioned is their insistence that there's this thing called the deep state, and they're going to come in and politicize the federal workforce. And this series, it's not just me. I kind of curated a group of 7 writers, and we sort of airdropped them into the federal workforce just to say, who are these people who are the deep state? And the stories are amazing. I mean, it's like they're tear-jerking public service. And I would love for the Trump operation to sort of like be poked and prodded a bit more about this plan, the Project 2025 plan, to like, we're going to sort of like eliminate huge chunks of the federal workforce, and we're gonna make 50,000 of these employees political appointees so we can fire them on a whim. And if they're poked and prodded on that, I think that the answer is going to be embarrassing. It is not a way to run the federal government, and in some cases, kind of a little dangerous. So that's what J.D. Vance has been talking about lately. That sort of caught my ear.
Michael, 2 things. One is former President Trump has said that he's repeatedly said that he's not necessarily in favor of the 2025 plan. But one of the things he has said that he's absolutely in favor of is Elon Musk's suggestion to him. And he now wants Elon Musk to effectively run a group of people to look at efficiencies inside the government. You spent a lot of time looking inside the government. How much efficiency is there really to wring out?
So this is a great question. It's not the worst idea in the world to like turn the public's attention to the efficiency of the federal government. There are things that can be done. I mean, but it's almost in the opposite direction of the noise he's been making. I mean, we have 4,000 presidential appointees who run the government, and their nominations are held up for years in Congress, and so it's effectively the management layer at the top of the workforce is hamstrung. I mean, that's something you would want to address. I mean, eliminate some of that friction. There is, I'm sure, you go into some of the agencies and there's lard and there's fat and there's waste. I mean, of course there is. There is in the private sector. But what you actually find when you kind of kick around, what to most people are obscure agencies, Department of Labor or Commerce or Agriculture, is you find like people doing their best at really kind of mission critical jobs in spite of a kind of a hostile public, in spite of a neglectful Congress, like in spite of management that turns over every 2 years. So I'm sure there are things to do. I'm just not so sure the spirit in which they operate is the best spirit to come in, which is like, these are wasteful, inefficient, corrupt people, and I'm going to whip them into shape by firing a bunch of them and politicizing the rest. That doesn't seem like the brightest approach.
Michael, let me ask you a different question. You've covered Wall Street, you've covered Silicon Valley, you've covered business for a very long time, and you've covered the politics and policy of it all. It feels like with this election, there are more folks in the world of business taking a political role or a very vocal role. It may be a function of social media, I don't know. But where you have clear divisions now in Silicon Valley, for example, it just seems different. Is it different?
This is a longer conversation, but I think one of the things that's happened is just social media has forced everybody into feeling like they have to have an opinion. And there's a mechanism to have a quick opinion. So that people are, they're out there and they're saying things and they get anchored in an opinion, and then they're all of a sudden in a tribe, and they're sort of forced to defend that, as opposed to just doing what business people historically have done, is lay low and let the storm pass. So I think that's partly it. And partly, I mean, these are such polarized times, right? So you got to pick a side. And you're constantly asked to pick a side.
Michael, I do want to go back to the sort of policy, political conversation. You were talking about social media and just how it's forced everybody in some way to speak out one way or the other. But are you surprised at sort of even the fault lines, even within industries now, like Silicon Valley, where you have, folks who historically were maybe considered left or liberal, splitting in this sort of unique way that they have?
Not really. I mean, Silicon Valley always had a right-wing streak in it. So no, not really at all. I mean, I think it's just louder, right? I mean, I see this in a smaller way, in like the responses to my books. That people, when books come out, people get angry, and you used to kind of hear it a little bit, and now it's just amplified massively on social media, and it's amplified in people. And people, I think the big thing is people get identified. Wedded to and identified by some point of view that they have publicly expressed, and they're sort of stuck with it, and then they get attacked for it, and then they get their backs up against the wall, and then it escalates. So I don't think. I mean, when first time I covered Silicon Valley was during the internet bubble, and I can remember wandering around and being surprised by just how many Republicans there were there. They were quiet. So no, it doesn't surprise me.
I want to talk about this paperback of your book about SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried. There's a couple of things happening, by the way, just right now. Carolyn Ellison, of course, who testified against Sam Bankman-Fried, her sentencing is going to happen soon. We now have the government saying that they believe there should be no prison time. As somebody who was in the middle of this and who knew Caroline and who knew Ryan Salem and who knew, obviously, Sam Bankman-Fried, what do you think about prison time for her and the others?
You want me to sentence her?
You could. You know a lot. You probably know more than the judge does.
So can I make a slightly different point rather than sentencing people on television? And the slightly different point is we take for granted something that's very peculiar about our judicial process, which is plea bargaining. That the three people who were close to Sam Bankman-Fried were used by the prosecution to make the case. And of course, they're obliged to tell the truth, et cetera, et cetera. But they are incentivized to say certain things in exchange for years of their lives. If you told this to an English person, they'd say, that sounds corrupt. You're like paying people to testify. And it does queer, it sort of queers the narrative in the courtroom in just shocking ways. So I don't. God knows what's going to happen. Kaplan, the judge, seems very ill-disposed towards everybody except Caroline. He seemed when he was rendering Sam's verdict, and we put Sam in jail for 25 years. He seemed kind of sweet on Caroline and thought Caroline had actually sort of identified the pieces of Sam's character that had led to the catastrophe. So I would guess that she's going to get less than the other two witnesses, but I'd be surprised if she got nothing. What
do you think of this Ryan Salem situation where you have, he's coming back and saying that he was lied to effectively by the government, that he effectively testified in part to protect his wife. Yeah. His partner, and now that she's not protected, that they have gone back on that, and as a result, the entire situation should be upended.
So I was surprised that anybody could violate our campaign finance laws the way they are. It seems to me you could kind of do almost anything you want right now with money in politics. And the thought that anybody was going to be sent away for 7.5 years for campaign finance violations would have shocked me before all this happened. I would have loved to have seen a trial. I don't think he can go back. I mean, the judges said he can't go back. But yes, this is at the bottom of it, right? It's sort of like there are these winks and nods between the defense and the prosecution. and people come away with what they think is an understanding of what the deal is, even though it's not in print. And anything can happen. And Kaplan could throw Caroline in jail for 20 years. But so I mean, they've got a judge who's famously a harsh sentencer. He's clearly irked, especially by the whole FTX situation and the political campaign law violation. So I assume that the sentence is going to be on the harsh side.
Michael Lewis, one of the great legendary chroniclers of our time in business and policy and so much more. The book, Going Infinite in paperback, has a new afterword. It's great to see you, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Do this again soon.
Thanks for having me.
And that's the pod for today. Thanks for listening. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernen, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern to get the smartest takes and analysis from our TV show right into your ears. Well, follow Squawk Pod wherever you get your podcasts. We'll meet you back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.